Right, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our Civil Discourse Series program on social media and society. We're happy to at least virtually see you all this evening. My name is Annie Black, and I am the Director of Programs and Volunteers for the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Before we get started, I just wanted to make a couple of logistical announcements. We will have time for questions at the end of the program tonight. If you want to go ahead and locate your Q&A button on your screen, if you're on a computer, it will likely be there at the bottom. If you are on a tablet or other mobile device, it might be at the top. But anytime you have a question, please go ahead and open that Q&A box, go ahead and type it in. We'll keep track of those and get to as many as we can at the end of the program. So I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Mary Pat?
Thank you so much, Annie. As Annie said, I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for our Civil Discourse Series. I'd like to start by thanking our presenting sponsor for the Civil Discourse Series, the Meadows Foundation. I'd also like to thank our partners on tonight's program, AJC's Community of Conscience and Communities Foundation of Texas, with a special thanks to Joel Schweitzer, Regional Director of AJC Dallas, and Nicole Paquette, Director of Marketing and Communications for Communities Foundation of Texas. We are also very grateful for the support of our community partners for this program: Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Services, Reach of Dallas, SMU Human Rights Program, Southwest Jewish Congress, Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission, The Family Place, and World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Thank you so much for your support and partnership. We really value our partnership. I'd also like to give a special welcome to our museum members in the audience tonight. I miss seeing you in person, but I am so grateful that you are continuing to join us for programs virtually. Your support is so crucial to our mission, and we would not be able to put on programs like this without you. And I'm also very grateful for the ongoing support of our board of directors. I know many of you are watching tonight, and I am so grateful for your steadfast support this year, as always. The goal of the Civil Discourse Series is to have a respectful dialogue about some thought-provoking topics. This series gives us the opportunity to experience a range of perspectives and consider views that may be different than our own. We see our role in the community not only as an educational institution, but also as a convener, serving as a place where we can gather to learn from one another in a civil, respectful manner, something we all need to work on. Tonight, we will discuss social media and society, a topic that I know has been on a lot of people's minds, especially this year. We hope tonight's event will serve as one of many opportunities to come together and talk about how we can stay engaged and informed in an increasingly virtual world. As Annie mentioned, we will leave plenty of time for questions at the end of our program. Please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your questions. And now I'd like to welcome Joel Schweitzer, Regional Director of AJC Dallas, to share some remarks and introduce our speakers. Joel?
Thank you so much, Mary Pat. We're delighted, as always, to have the opportunity to work with the Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. It really has been such a stellar partnership, and also with Communities of Foundation of Texas, and we're excited to have the opportunity for the community of conscience to add its voice to this critical conversation. I don't know about any of you, but after Tuesday night, the idea of coming together in the name of civil discourse just feels right and feels good. So thank you all for coming and being with us tonight. A little bit about the community of conscience. AJC formed this coalition in 2019, both nationally and across our 23 regional offices. The community of conscience represents a bipartisan and diverse group of civic, religious, and ethnic leaders. The Dallas Coalition runs the gamut, including among its 36 or so members, Ken Hirsch, president of the George W. Bush Presidential Center, Khalid Shahid, Imam Emeritus of the oldest mosque in Dallas, Masjid al-Islam, Liz Sadia-Pariah, Chief Equity Officer for the City of Dallas, and of course our partner in tonight's conversation, Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. As a coalition representative of the broad spectrum of diverse thought, faith, background, and experience, we unite in the spirit of e pluribus unum, out of many, one, to advance our shared American values of pluralism, civil discourse, and mutual respect. Before I introduce our moderator and panelists, I'd like to encourage each of you to take a moment to think of one or two of the biggest boons that social media has brought to your life. Maybe it's a reunion with an old friend, a discovery of a long-lost relative, or connecting with a group of like-minded enthusiasts that share a hobby or interest with you. I don't think that I have to, on the other hand, ask you to envision one of the more negative aspects of social media. We all know them, and we live with them daily. Trolls, fake news, arguments that quickly devolve as we sit behind the anonymity of our screens. Clearly, social media can be a positive force in our lives, but it may take proactive effort to make that more the rule and less the exception. An exploration of how we get there is what makes tonight's conversation central to transforming Dallas into a community of conscience. I'm so pleased to partner with the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum and the Communities Foundation of Texas to bring this important conversation to the fore. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator and our panelists. First, the panelists. Jamil Jeffer is the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Under his leadership, the Institute has filed precedent-setting litigation, undertaken major interdisciplinary research initiatives, and become an influential voice in debates about the freedoms of speech and the press in the digital age. Jeffer previously served as deputy legal director at the ACLU. Amy Mitchell is Director of Journalism Research at Pew Research Center. She is responsible for the center's research related to news and information, including how the public accesses, engages with, and creates news, what news organizations are providing, and how technology is changing all of these elements. She specializes in how technology is changing the flow of news information today and the influence of political identity on news choices. Dave Sifri is Vice President of the Center for Technology and Society, the Anti-Defamation League. In his role, Sifri leads a team developing proactive solutions, producing cutting-edge research to protect vulnerable populations. The center serves as a vital resource to legislators, journalists, universities, community organizations, tech platforms, and anyone who has been a target of online hate and harassment. He joined the ADL in 2019 after a storied career as a technology entrepreneur and executive. And finally, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Lotta Knott. She's an attorney with expertise in the intersection of law, technology, and expression. She is a fellow for the First Amendment at the Freedom Forum, an organization dedicated to fostering First Amendment freedoms for all. Knott was formerly the Assistant Director of Admissions at the Georgetown University Law Center and a litigator in New York City, where she maintained an active pro bono practice focused on asylum cases and developed a proficiency in legal issues surrounding the internet, data privacy, and cybersecurity. Lotta, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Joel. And thank you so much for having me and for having all of us here for this amazing event. I'm really glad that we are getting a chance to discuss social media and society, and because it's just come to the fore right now as such an issue that affects everything that's going on right now, including the upcoming election. And I want to start by saying that the First Amendment prevents the government from censoring us or punishing us for our speech. But, you know, it's interesting. It doesn't apply to private organizations. When we look at the decisions that Facebook and YouTube and Twitter regularly make about what types of content they'll allow on their platforms, as private companies, they're free to create their own policies and censor posts and ban users as they see fit. That's in fact their First Amendment right. But for me, I think of these issues as First Amendment-ish issues. Technically, they're outside the scope of the First Amendment, but they have such an outsized impact on what we might consider the First Amendment's purpose, ensuring that citizens have access to information about the world around them, that they can hear different viewpoints and share their ideas. It really is our new public sphere. And now that so many of our conversations take place on these platforms, and the companies behind them, they have such an enormous influence in the public discourse. So even if it's not a First Amendment issue, the First Amendment-ish implications are huge, and they become even thornier when you consider fake news and misleading content, because censoring a fake news item might run counter to the spirit of free speech, but allowing it to spread undermines the purpose of a free press. So there's just so much to unpack here. And so I want to start actually by turning it over to our panelists. I'd like to start by hearing about how all of you approach this topic. If you could just give us about 2 minutes on your work and where you're coming from. Jamil, can we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Leta, and thanks for the invitation to participate in the event. I'm really glad to be here. So how did I get to this work? So I was at the ACLU for 15 years, working first on national security cases after 9/11, and then I took over something called the Center for Democracy at the ACLU, which houses the free speech and privacy and human rights work, and litigated in that context a lot of cases involving the intersection of privacy and free speech. And that's where a lot of the action is now when it comes to free speech online. There, a lot of these issues involve the intersection of free speech and privacy. So I was working on those cases, and then I started up at the Knight Institute 4 years ago. The Knight Institute is a new institute. It's only 4 years old, and we were founded by Lee Bollinger, the president of Columbia, and Alberto Ibargüen, the president of the Knight Foundation, to focus on digital age free speech questions. And we've been working on a lot of questions involving social media platforms, government transparency, again, the intersection of free speech and privacy. Probably the case that has got the most attention is our challenge to President Trump's practice of blocking critics from his Twitter account, which is really an effort to bring the public forum doctrine, which is kind of well-established legal doctrine that applies in offline spaces like town halls and city council meetings, to bring that forum doctrine onto online. And we've been successful thus far in establishing that President Trump's Twitter account is a public forum, which means he can't constitutionally block people from that account on the basis of viewpoint. And we won that in the district court and the Court of Appeals, and the government's petition is now pending before the Supreme Court. But that's one little slice of the set of questions that I think we're going to be talking about this evening, about whether the First Amendment applies to social media and what it means to say that the First Amendment applies to social media. Obviously, a question we could probably talk about for hours.
Thank you, Jamil. Amy, what about you? What brought you here, and where are you coming from when we talk about these subjects tonight?
Yes, thanks so much again also for letting me and the Pew Research Center be a part of this conversation. So as mentioned, I direct our research around news, around journalism. And so the perspective that I bring to this is really how Americans and people outside the US as well, a lot of our research focuses on the US population, but how people are using social media as a way to be informed, the degree to which that has entered into the news environment sphere. We began studying social media way back around 2010, was sort of the first work around Facebook and the role of news on Facebook, and have been building around not just sort of the degree to which people are turning there, where we have more than half of US adults that are saying they at least sometimes are getting news through these venues, but also what it means for their understanding of the facts and the world around them. So some of our more recent research has looked at, questions about knowledge, perception, and exposure to different news stories that are taking place today, and the degree to which people who may rely more strongly on social media differ from others in those types of areas. We also do a lot of work that's looking at on the content side of some of these platforms. So for example, we just put out a new study this week that looks at YouTube. And so we start with some surveys on, it's got the second widest reach for US adult population for news in the US here, but when it comes to social media sites. But so then we did an audit and a content study of some of the most popular in terms of being turned to channels that have news to try to answer some questions about what is it that people get when they go there. It's a space that hasn't been studied as deeply in terms of the content itself. So trying to look at the different angles in terms of how this comes into play in the informed citizenry, and then certainly the questions around misinformation and made up news.
Thank you. That sounds fascinating. I'm looking forward to delving into that further with you. And Dave, can you tell me about your work for a couple of minutes?
Sure. Thanks, Lotta. And I just want to also thanks for the invitation to be able to come and speak to the folks here tonight. So the Center for Technology and Society at the Anti-Defamation League, in a sense, you could think of us as sort of the Silicon Valley office of the oldest and largest anti-hate organization. The ADL was started about 107 years ago, and we've been tracking, hate certainly well before people even had modems. And what we've been watching over time is how the offline hate and harassment, the targeting and victimization of people has moved online. And, as part of that, we've had relationships, very deep relationships with all of the major platform players at the highest levels, right? At the policy level, at the enforcement and trust and safety level, and also at the product development level, because so much of this is not about what speech is allowed on the platform. And there's certainly those kinds of questions. There's actually a really deeper question here around how speech gets amplified on the platform and what kind of algorithms are used, right? These methods that decide what you actually see in your newsfeed when you open up Facebook or when you open up Twitter or you open up YouTube. Those are decisions that are getting made behind the scenes. And the decisions are often based on things like engagement, right? Or things that get you to keep coming back. So what we do at the Center for Technology and Society is go that next level or two deeper in terms of really holding out for the customer, the user, the consumer's voice here, and making sure that we work with the platforms when there are incidents of hate and harassment and incitement to violence and all the rest. But we also work with them very closely around how they can build their products in a more pro-social way, in ways that help to de-amplify or de-escalate or help to reduce the amount and the reach of misinformation and disinformation on the platforms. And when they don't take those recommendations, or they are clearly not doing them for other reasons like profit, we hold their feet to the fire, and we work in the public sphere along with our government relations and community engagement folks and civil rights lawyers to work throughout the different forms of society to be able to reduce the amount of hate that then gets promulgated and amplified on these platforms. So my background, I'm actually a 25-year tech entrepreneur. I built companies like this. I've worked with and know deeply the different founders and executives at these companies. So part of what we're doing at ADL is not only coming at it from an advocacy and in some cases, regulatory or research kind of perspective, but also working closely within the sphere of the companies and their product groups to get them to make the necessary changes that really help resolve this while still maintaining free speech, while still ensuring that our civil rights are protected.
Thank you so much, Dave. And I appreciate that point you made that social media platforms, it's not just about the content that's on them and the decisions about content, but it's about the way the algorithms, the methods, the processes they have for choosing what to amplify, what comes across to people. It's not just print media that happens to be on your screen. They operate in a different way. And that kind of brings me to what I want to talk about first, which is, you know, now that, Amy, you mentioned that half of Americans rely on social media for their news. Should we be thinking about social media the same way we think about traditional news outlets? What have you found in Pew's research?
Well, I think everybody on this panel would have some wise words on this. I think it's yes and no. I mean, it's a very different type of platform. It's not a producer of original news. There's no original content that the site is creating. It's the structure and the feed. And so it is not a news outlet in the sense of production. At the same time, it is a very significant part of the news ecosystem today. It's a very significant part of the way people are being informed, and the way it functions, the way news works there is entirely different than what we've had in other platforms. Even if you think about the shift, you know, if the advent of the internet sort of changed our world, the social media really flipped it upside down when it comes to news, because news is mixed in with all this other type of content. People land upon it. You know, one of the first things we found early on in our research was that more people said they happen upon news in this space than seek it out. And so that's a very different structure than when you think of the earlier, you know, times of news. Now we're more used to that through all the different alerts and pop-ups and other ways that we also get things put in front of us, but it's a different type of experience. And we have found even in our own work that when we ask people about news and social media, we started defining it in a way that we didn't used to do when you ask about other platforms. So to put some limitations, that it's things beyond, you know, events and issues beyond your friends and family, so that there's some sort of boundary of what fits into that news space. We've also found that when we ask about people, you know, in an open end, what your main source of news is, that there's a significant portion of the public that does think of a social media site as their source of news. So even if we specify, you know, what we mean here is, you know, a specific outlet that's producing the news, we'll get things like Facebook or Twitter or other things that mention. So people do think of it as their source of news. And in that sense, we have to be considering it as a way that people are getting informed.
And that's interesting, because you're right. Even if you're not producing news, people think of you as their news source. And I mean, what I also find interesting, and Jamil, I'm sorry, you must get tired of talking about this case, but it's such a good one with with considering like Twitter to be a public forum for President Trump. Like, how do people use social media in that way, in like a public forum, as opposed to just a private chat service?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, you know, we sometimes talk at the level of is social media covered by the First Amendment? And I actually think it's a lot more complicated. It's impossible to answer that question at that level of generality. This case that we filed is about not Twitter, but about a specific Twitter account, right? And the argument we're making is that President Trump's Twitter account is a public forum. And we're making that argument because he's using that account in the same way that public officials have always used town halls or city council meetings or school board meetings. This is a forum, it's a digital forum, but effectively the president is standing at the front of the room and he is addressing the assembled citizenry in front of him. And citizens are reacting to him and talking with one another about his statements. So it's a digital version of a town hall, but it is nonetheless a town hall and serves the same function as a town hall, with the president sharing information about government and the people assembled in front of him exchanging ideas about the information that the president is sharing. And so we saw this as a kind of online version of what had always gone on offline. And, you know, like I said earlier, the courts have so far seen it our way. But the argument we're making is really limited to this Twitter account and to the accounts of other public officials who use their social media accounts in the same way. There are other organizations out there and other individuals who are making a broader argument. They're arguing that Twitter is a public forum. It should be understood as a public forum. That phrase, public forum, has a specific meaning in First Amendment law and specific implications. If you accept that Twitter is a public forum, what it means is that Twitter can't block people from its site, can't exclude people from its site based on viewpoint. And I'm fine with the idea that the president can't exclude people from his Twitter account on the basis of viewpoint. I think that's a good thing that the president can't do that. I think that the First Amendment is properly understood as protecting a citizen's right to disagree with the president, and the president shouldn't be able to kick you out of a public forum just because you have a different opinion than he does. But when it comes to Twitter, I don't feel the same way. I don't think, first of all, you know, as you said earlier, Lata, the First Amendment doesn't bind Twitter. Twitter is a private actor. Twitter has its own First Amendment rights. But even setting the First Amendment aside, I'm not sure it would be a great thing for the world if Twitter didn't have the power to exclude people based on viewpoint. For one thing, it would make it impossible for Twitter to exclude people for exactly the kind of hateful speech that I think we're, you know, focused on this evening. And I think we want Twitter to be able to respond in some way to that kind of speech, because if you allow a platform like Twitter to be overrun by that kind of speech, it's not going to be useful to anyone. Nobody's going to want to participate in a forum that is characterized by hate speech. So, you know, I have reservations about the companies being overly aggressive at taking speech down. I worry that if we invest too much authority in the companies to take speech down, then they're going to take down a lot more than what we want them to take down. But I also worry about taking away from the companies the power to moderate speech on their platforms, because I think that some form of moderation is crucial to having a digital public sphere that actually works for our society and works for our democracy.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that, I mean, that raises the point where I think most people would agree that they want some content moderation on social media platforms. But there's this question that comes up again and again about whether there's too much moderation of certain types of content, whether social media platforms are biased. And, you know, you hear that from certain people think that it's biased and that certain types of content is more likely to get taken down. This is a question for everybody. Is that accurate? What are your perceptions of this?
Well, I can certainly say from the public perspective, you know, we have asked about, you know, the degree to which the public thinks that the social media companies have too much control over the news they see. And a majority say that they do think they have too much control. We also had over 80% say that they think they treat some news organizations differently than others. And when we follow up with the how, you know, what is it that they do differently, the answers that have the largest responses are producing first that attention grabbing, you know, kind of information, and those things that will gather a lot of social media followers. But then the third is politically, you know, something that carries one political stance or another. So there's certainly a sense among the public that there are distinctions being made there.
I don't think that there's evidence for the proposition that the platforms are, you know, biased against conservatives or biased against liberals. I haven't seen that evidence, but I do think that the platforms are biased in favor of speech that engages people. And speech that engages people tends to be more sensationalist, more extreme. People are more likely to share things that shock them. And, you know, that has real effects on the health of our public discourse. You know, it sort of drives people to the polls. It can have the effect of creating kind of filter bubbles or echo chambers where you only hear the opinions of people who agree with you. I think it's a mistake to assume that the platform's commercial interests are going to result in policies that serve our democracy. I do think that the platforms, to some extent, have an interest in, they certainly have an interest in having platforms that work for their users in some sense. They need to please their shareholders, and pleasing their shareholders means pleasing their users to some, in some way. But ultimately the platforms are maximizing a different variable than the rest of us really need them to maximize. They are maximizing for shareholder value, and what we really need them to maximize for, given the role that they now play in our society, is a kind of healthy public discourse. Public discourse that serves our society and serves our democracy. And I'm not going to pretend to have, an answer to what that looks like. But I know that it's different from what the platforms are serving up right now.
Yeah, and just to reinforce a lot of what Jamil and Amy said earlier, I think looking at this purely as a particular bias, whether it's left or right, conservative or liberal, is actually not the right framing of it. I think that to recognize that what really this comes down to, especially in the world of social media, is that everybody's experience is personalized. And what you click on, what you share, what you pause on as you are scrolling, all of that data is collected and tracked in order to be able to get you to be optimized for a particular set of metrics. And those metrics are, like, loosely they're called engagement, right? And engagement essentially means you are spending more time with us, right? We have your attention. And what are the kinds of things that keep and hold people's attention? Number one, it's things that, as Jamil was saying, right, are controversial. Things that are, make your blood boil. Things that maybe show an obvious bias that or things that are confirmatory, right? So there's a lot of research here that shows that people are very, very interested in things that confirm their pre-existing biases. And so they're much less critical thinkers about, when I read an article that is talking about something extraordinary that validates a pre-existing belief that I already have. Now, what does that then do? I'll hit like, I'll hit share, I will write a comment. Again, these are all things that the social media companies are looking at because they actually increase that viral loop, because now your friends see it. Ooh, Dave liked this article. Well, now I can show that article to Dave's friends. And so what we've created here is a business model that also is tuned towards high engagement, right? The advertising business model. So it's super important to recognize you are not the customer. Okay, like you are, if you're not paying for it, you're the product, you're not the customer. The customers then are the people who are paying for the product, which in this case is our attention, right? And those are, by and large, the advertisers. Now, what's very interesting, and I think it's one of the things that we realized as we were going back to the companies at ADL, we developed a set of product recommendations around changes to the product that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, right, that they could be making to help reduce this amount of hatred while still maintaining a high level of engagement. And we got tremendous response from YouTube and Twitter, right, in terms of good actors, because I do think longer term it is in their best interest. But Facebook essentially said, not interested, right? And they threw a free speech argument back. You know what, and here's where I just have to say that's a smokescreen, right? They're a private company. This isn't about free speech. This is about, what things they're amplifying. And what we've been noticing is that those echo chambers, those places where our bubbles get reinforced, were growing more and more deeply, and that the amount of chaos and civic unrest that was occurring and being literally facilitated by the recommendation engines themselves, that these things were causing deep hurt, deep pain, and it literally were being reinforced because you were getting groups that were suggested to you that would then tend people towards a path of radicalization and even to potential violence. And what we realized was that there was an opportunity, post the George Floyd murder, and with Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, right? That there was a moment here in the United States to look at social media's role in terms of creating the incredibly different viewpoints and then reinforcing them, and that this was now a question of values. And so we launched the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, where we had immediately over 1,100 of the world's largest advertisers who said, we do not agree with this. This does not stand for us, right? And we need to see real change being made. And so, we've been incredibly grateful, and the movement's been very, very powerful to actually forcing real change. And not just at Facebook, but also at other social media companies. So I think the goal here is to recognize that, it's important that people be able to speak and be able to be heard, but these algorithms that are promoting this, this sort of civil fracture is just dangerous for ourselves as a society, and that we as a society need to stand up for what's right.
No, thank you for talking about the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. But I did want to get some opinions. You mentioned that the Facebook free speech argument is sort of a smokescreen, but is there a question about where this campaign falls under the First Amendment, about the tension between free speech and hate speech?
So first of all, Facebook is a commercial enterprise, just like your local Starbucks or your local deli. And as such, if a neo-Nazi walked into your local Starbucks or your local deli or your local Target or Walmart and started parading around with a megaphone, yelling and harassing people, they would get kicked out by the management. If they decided that they were going to have a group meeting in the Starbucks waiting area, right, the manager would shoo them out. Right, so this isn't about First Amendment, right? They want to go and meet in the park and they can get a permit and go do that. This is free speech, absolutely. But in this case, now I will say Jamil's point is absolutely true. When we're talking about governmental actors who are using a platform, the free speech arguments absolutely are appropriate. But this is a very different usage of the free speech. Free speech restricts what the government can do. It doesn't restrict what commercial enterprises can do. It's up to them to decide what values are pertaining to them. And therefore, they can say no shoes, no shirt, no service, right? They can decide who gets to come into their place of business. And this is all that we expect of social media companies as well.
So can I jump in on that, Letta?
Of course.
Yeah. So I agree with almost. I think I agree with all of that. I just think that there's one complication that is worth highlighting here, which is that Facebook is different from Starbucks in one way, and that is that Facebook controls access to what passes for the public square these days. If you want to speak in the digital public square, you need effectively the permission of these new speech gatekeepers like Facebook or Twitter. And that puts a huge amount of power in the hands of these private companies that, at least in the case of Facebook, are run by a very small number of people, and Facebook really just one person. From a kind of free speech perspective, I think it is problematic that so much power over who can speak and what gets said, what gets heard, is in the hands of such a small number of private actors. And I always find myself conflicted here because, as I said earlier, I often find myself wanting these private actors to do more than they're doing to ensure that their platforms are, again, kind of working for society. But every time we ask them to do more, their power over the public square grows. We as a society kind of accept that these private actors are going to be deciding who gets to speak, and not just who gets to speak, but as Dave, you were pointing out earlier, their algorithms decide really who gets heard, and that's really even more important than this question of who gets to speak. And so I guess I would be much more comfortable with this idea of civil rights groups pressuring the private companies to moderate content on their platforms more aggressively if there were more private platforms, if there were a kind of diversity of platforms, and we weren't all turning our energies to the one or two gatekeepers of the public square. There is something, I think, broken about the current system where these decisions that are so important to our democracy, decisions about who can speak and who gets heard, etc., are being made by private actors who are not subject to regulation really of any of any kind. And so that's not to say that I think the campaign is misguided. I am very sympathetic to the campaign, but the context in which this campaign is being pursued, I think makes all of this more complicated than it would otherwise be.
And Jamil, if I can respond to that, I think by and large, I think we're actually in deep agreement. So to recognize though that there is this enormous network effect and a huge oligopoly that's going on is separate from saying that there's a free speech concern here, right? So we could decide, for example, as a country, that there need to be some kind of governmental oversight and regulations around how these social media companies operate, right? Whether it's in the antitrust realm or it's, FCC, FTC, like, agencies and the like. But now that's where, if the government is starting to tell them what they can and can't do, there are absolutely some free speech concerns and First Amendment concerns that start to arrive. But I think you and I are in agreement that, that there's a significant power imbalance today with regards to what a very small group of people are deciding a very large mass of the American public are getting to hear, and therefore what they're not hearing.
Free speech concern. I think it's a free speech concern because, like, if you look back at some of the most important First Amendment decisions of the last 100 years, there have only been 100 years of First Amendment decisions, but if you look back at sort of post-Second World War cases, a lot of what informed the development of the modern First Amendment was distrust of the government exercising a kind of monopoly power over public discourse. And it's true, we were concerned about the government, right? But it wasn't so much because it was the government. It was because the government had this potential to be a kind of monopolist in the area of public discourse, and we didn't want the government to decide for us what we thought or what we should think. We wanted individuals to be able to decide for themselves what they thought and what should be said and what should be shared with their fellow citizens. And I think I'm not making the argument that Facebook should be subject to the First Amendment, but I do think that the same reasons that led us to be distrustful of monopoly power in the public arena when it was the government exercising that power should lead us to be distrustful when a private actor exercises that kind of power. And again, I'm not sure what to do with that. I mean, maybe the solution there is just more aggressive antitrust enforcement. But I do think it's a First Amendment concern. I think, not a First Amendment, a free speech concern. If a private actor has so much power to shape and influence and distort public discourse.
If you want to use that terribly awkward word I coined, First Amendment-ish, you can.
Yeah.
But to your point, I don't think anybody foresaw that you'd have these private companies that had this kind of monopolistic power that previously only the government did. And I mean, that leads me to my final question, really, which is that we have been talking about hate on these platforms and how we should approach that. What about, the First Amendment protects lies, it protects false information. Obviously, the platforms have all gone there with their own policies towards what we call fake news, mis and disinformation. But really, whose responsibility is this? Is it the platform's responsibility? Is it users of social media? Do we have a responsibility to filter the information we see and determine what's true? And actually, if I could start with you, Amy, because the Pew Research report said that people who get their news from social media are less knowledgeable and less engaged than people who get it from elsewhere. I think that's a good baseline for talking about how we filter information.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions is, how this swirl of information, misinformation, made-up news, and choices are impacting, what people know, learn, hear, perceive about what's going on. And one of the things that we've looked at is if you look at people who say the primary way they get political news is through social media. They might have some other avenues, but it's their primary mechanism. They do stand apart in a lot of ways from others, from those who named, one of the other pathways as their primary method. And, first and foremost, they tend to be less engaged with the news generally. They tend to be following the news less closely. Some of that can be attributed to age a little bit, but it all holds, even if you are factoring in the point that there are younger people that tend to be using social media more prominently. And then they also tend to have less knowledge about certain current events. So we did this whole battery of, a range of different questions about some sort of more current events and some that were just sort of basic general political knowledge. And overall, sort of that index score was by far the lowest among those who primarily rely on social media, as well as in some cases, those who turn mostly to local television for news. And then when we ask about, even their sort of sense of how well they understand things, they're expressing less certainty around events. So they were, the least likely to say that they felt they understood what was happening, in the Democratic primaries, or understood what was happening in the impeachment process. So they're just, their own sense of understanding and confidence in what's happening tends to be lower. When we get to the areas of, questions of made up news and information, those who rely mostly on this platform express less concern about it, but also tend to have higher exposure to certain threads of made up news and information. So sort of that combination of being, generally less tied to following the news closely, some less general knowledge, less concern about it, but greater exposure in many instances.
That's alarming. And there's a word for that phenomenon where the less you know about something, the more sure you are about it. I can't remember what it is anymore, but there's just to know that you have the highest exposure to fake news, but the least concern about it is sort of startling to me. But how should the platforms be dealing with this in an ideal world? And is there a difference between how a platform should approach fake news about politics as opposed to fake news about science? Jamil, Dave, any opinions on this?
I can talk a little bit about the research and the work that ADL is doing to work with the different platforms. So one of the areas is around identifying misinformation and disinformation quickly and stopping it before the virality hits a peak, right? So the addition of a variety of fact-checking organizations into that flow, and recognizing, right, it's the old saying, a lie can travel the world 7 times while the truth is still getting its pants on, right? It's absolutely, if it's true, it's squared in the world of social media. And so part of this is about recognizing early in that virality process that when somebody posts something that is, you know, controversial, salacious, potentially misinformative or disinformative, right? That to be able to catch that early in the process as it's starting up that virality curve, to attenuate it, right? And these are all things that are entirely inside of the control of a Facebook, a Twitter, a YouTube, a Reddit, and so on. And then to slow it down, get some fact checking, and then there's some discussion as to whether or not actual fact checking labels are actually helpful or not. There's some research that goes both ways on whether or not the fact checking labels or the potential misinformation labels, just because, you know, the old saying of, you know, just repeat the lie repeat the lie often enough and it just becomes common sense truth. So, you know, so then the question is, do they de-amplify that? Do they look at, you know, the people who have been liking and sharing that information, and do they actually de-amplify their postings? Does it get removed from search and discovery? So Twitter did a very interesting thing recently around QAnon, because you can imagine, you know, it's actually relatively straightforward for movements that have leaders. Like if you're looking at David Duke, Richard Spencer, right? These people have been deplatformed from all of the major social media platforms. You have to go to Gab, you have to go to Parler, you have to go to, you know, a bunch of other places to be able to see them. But these leaderless movements and conspiracy theories have been extremely difficult to be able to look at and understand and then, you know, deal with. And what Twitter did recently, and I think to great effect, is that they started building tools to find those pieces of information in those conspiracy theories, and then look at the people. So the people who are actually actively promoting them and writing them, they literally would ban those accounts. But what they also found was there were a lot of people who would like something or just retweet something because they found it interesting. And so for those people, what they did was they kind of put them in a sort of 30-day, we're going to de-amplify them for a while because maybe it was just one thing that you saw, right? And then looking more carefully at them over time as a way of, again, de-amplifying from the contagion. Like you kind of have to think of this almost in a sort of a viral spread, you know, sort of look at, you know, looking at this in terms of how ideas spread. So I think that was actually then, you know, Facebook has now taken that and they're using that kind of a model as well. And I think these kinds of more sophisticated approaches to looking at the fact that, yes, there are sophisticated coordinated disinformation and misinformation campaigns that are out there, but the platforms themselves can slow it down and de-amplify it in order to be able to reduce the impact. And then of course, in the end, this all comes down to each one of us as individuals. How do we get better as news and social media consumers? So looking at the dates of articles when somebody sends something to you, actually reading an article before you reshare it and repost it. Twitter did, again, a very interesting product enhancement where if you just see an article on Twitter and you hit retweet, it will, without actually having clicked on it, it will ask you, are you sure that you want to do this? You haven't read this, right? And seeing how that actually reduces the spread of misinformation and disinformation. But in the end, it's about how do we learn how to be a better news consumer, to be able to check the URL, to be able to see, you know, what's that logo? Is that really the CNN logo, or does that look a little bit different, right? And to recognize that we are partly contributing to the problem and thinking before we click.
No, that's very true. I've read some statistics that 66% of people share links that they have never opened themselves, which I hope that's not this piece of misinformation I just shared, but that's terrifying as well.
Yeah, I'll just add one other note to that. It isn't, we do find that people will say, and these are people who are willing to say too, right, that they have done this. But we also find that even when you ask about sort of the different ways people might get news, whether it's social media or it's national news outlets or local, et cetera, that trust ranks very low for social media consistently. And that's across party, it's across, all wide range of different ways that you can break that data. And asked about a lot of different ways as well. So that there is a lot of skepticism about the news. People would say it doesn't really get them that much better informed than if they didn't use social media for news. But at the same time, large swaths are doing so. And a lot of that is convenience, and that it's there and that you're there doing other things. And so that sort of issue of self-discipline that Dave is speaking to, is definitely a part of this platform.
Yeah, thank you. And is there an issue though, in order to moderate content on these platforms, to say de-amplify something, someone has to be the arbiter of truth. Jamil, do you think that there's an issue there that might be a slippery slope?
I mean, I do. I mean, I guess I'm just, I have one answer to every question, or maybe I have two answers to every question, and they're inconsistent. So, I do think that we need the platforms to take responsibility for their algorithms, for their decisions to privilege certain speech or to marginalize certain speech. They need to be accountable for those decisions. But it is also true that every time we ask them to be accountable for those kinds of decisions, we entrench their roles as gatekeepers to, the public square. And that is itself that's a free speech problem and a democracy problem that we have to find some way to address. Some of this we had to deal with in that Trump Twitter case, because one of the most effective disseminators of misinformation about public health has been the president himself. And Twitter has been often people ask Twitter to take down that kind of misinformation, and instead what Twitter has been doing is flagging it as misinformation or putting it behind a screen, and on the theory that people should know what their public officials are saying, and that it puts Twitter in a very difficult position and uncomfortable position if Twitter is preventing people from hearing what their elected officials are saying. On the other hand, Twitter doesn't want to just amplify or just rebroadcast the president's misinformation. And you think you see this in other areas, not just with misinformation about the pandemic, but all sorts of speech that Twitter would otherwise take down, but doesn't take down because the person who's engaged in the speech is a public official. So that's just another variation on this set of problems. But I do think that at this stage we should be really thinking about what it means to hold these platforms accountable for their algorithmic decisions. What does that kind of accountability look like? Is it a matter of having them disclose more information about the algorithms themselves? Is it a matter of extending a cause of action to people who are harmed by the decisions that the platforms make? Is it a matter of removing the immunity that the platforms would otherwise enjoy? There are all sorts of ways you could hold them accountable in one sense or another for their algorithmic decisions. Which of those ways is the right way to go? I'm not ready to commit to one, but I think it's one relevant question is what are the free speech implications of holding the platforms accountable in these ways?
Right. No, thank you. Thank you all so much for those incredible, intelligent answers. I'd like to turn to some questions from the audience at this point. The first one we've got is, what are the limits of libel and defamation on social media, i.e. defamatory memes? And this one I will throw out to anyone who can answer it.
I'd suggest our First Amendment lawyer would be the expert on this.
Well, to the extent you're thinking about holding somebody accountable for their own speech online, online speech is just like offline speech. If you say something defamatory online, you can be held accountable in court in the same way that you could be held accountable if you said something defamatory offline. Now, there's a question of in what circumstances you can hold the platforms responsible for the speech that third parties engage in on those platforms. And there, the platforms enjoy very broad immunity under what's usually referred to as Section 230. And that's a very controversial immunity right now. Many people think that the platforms should be, you should be able to sue the platforms for hosting defamatory speech posted by third parties, at least if the platforms are made aware of the speech and don't take it down. That set of questions I think is very complicated. There are free speech implications to, if you force the platforms to take down defamatory speech, there's a question of how they're going to decide what speech is defamatory and what class of speech they're ultimately going to take down. Even if their obligation is to take down a narrow category of speech, they may, out of caution and out of a desire not to be held financially responsible for other speech, they may end up taking down much more than we want them to. So there's a kind of ongoing debate about whether Section 230 immunity should be repealed or narrowed. And there are there's a range of views on that question across the political spectrum. I think right now, Section 230 is a target of some people on the right, but there are also people on the left who would like to limit the immunity that the platforms have with respect to third-party speech.
Section 230 is truly the most boring sounding law that holds up the internet that we've ever heard of. But this next question is actually about, well, what happens when the platforms are taking down accounts? Like, what if Facebook is removing accounts because of what it defines as hate speech? Wouldn't this then become a platform for a certain viewpoint that doesn't welcome everyone to participate? Oh, good question.
I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, they've made very clear that there are certain viewpoints that they do not allow on the platform. If you are going to advocate violence, if you are going to continuously harass another user, if you are going to be insulting people based on a set of protected class and attributes, if you're going to spew anti-Semitism, right? Like this is just a small selection of things that will get your account canceled or banned by platforms like Facebook. And as a commercial enterprise, they're entirely within their rights to do that. So, they are making some pretty clear choices. And I think what they're trying to do, and this is funny, I don't want to put myself into the role of being a spokesperson for a social media company, but their stated goal is to allow as much of the civil discourse that isn't harmful and harassing and targeting and the like on their platform. But there are absolutely clear limits about what they will not allow.
So your answer would be yes, but it's not necessarily a problem.
Well, I should also be clear that policy is different from enforcement. So, Facebook and YouTube and other, social media platforms can have certain policies that are written, but like they have 30,000 often contractors, right, who are working, say, for Facebook, that are actually doing the task of trust and safety and content moderation. And they have artificial intelligence algorithms that they have been training to try to look and to, intercept some of this content and some of the kinds of accounts that are either, for example, if you create a bunch of bot accounts, right, synthetic fake accounts, right, that you know, they actually have these algorithms that look and try to find those accounts and then take them down and remove them from your newsfeed. So, you know, the question though is, how many of them do they actually catch? What happens when a content moderator is, you know, holds a particular political view and they make a very low amount of money working as a contractor, and they decide you're not violative, right? There, by the way, there's no one to call. So in fact, one of the demands that we have at the Stop Hate for Profit Coalition was that Facebook, especially for victims and targets of this kind of harassment, but you know, but I think certainly if your account was taken down in error, you need to be able to speak to a human being. I mean, my God, the airlines, when they lose your luggage, give you a phone number to call. There's a human being that you can speak to. And yet, I mean, unless you work for somebody like the ADL or one of these civil rights groups, like where you actually have the connections in, there is no phone number to call. There's no human being to contact. And we think that this is unconscionable. With the profits that they make, Facebook made $17 billion, billion with a B, in earnings last year. That they are not dedicating the time, energy, and resources to be able to provide assistance for people who are targeted or people who are victims of hate and harassment on these platforms. And in some cases, people who are unfairly removed, that there's no human being to be able to speak to, we think is just wrong and needs to be changed.
That's understandable. And in terms of accountability, our next question is actually accountability in a bit of a different vein, but we've been asked, has the FCC not developed any regulations to alleviate some of the concerns raised tonight?
Ooh, you want that one, Jamil?
All right, go for it, Dave.
Oh, you know what? I am not a government lawyer. I don't play one on TV. And so I'm probably going to butcher this, and please come in and rescue me. The Trump administration recently, through executive order, has directed a number of departments inside of the government to start building. What is the word I'm looking for? It's these, you know, these sorts of recommendations for the FCC and the FTC to actually start looking at potential enforcement actions. There is a lot of question as to the overall legality of this and the propriety of it. I'm about reaching the. I'm reaching the limits of my expertise here, so I'll hand this off to Jamil.
Well, I mean, there was this executive order that Dave mentions that President Trump issued just a few weeks ago, really in retaliation for Twitter labeling some of the president's tweets as misinformation, effectively. And in response, the President Trump issued an executive order that purports to be directing various federal agencies to protect free speech against the censorship of the social media platforms, but is in fact an effort to retaliate against the social media platforms for their exercise of their own First Amendment rights. So, I mean, that's the most, and it's been challenged in court. I think the Center for Democracy and Technology has challenged that executive order. I think there may be another challenge in court as well. And I suspect that those challenges will be successful. But this space more generally is not a highly regulated space. I mean, there is Section 230, which is a very important law that the platforms say is crucial to their continued existence. and that some critics say is responsible for many of the pathologies of the internet right now. So Section 230 is certainly a very important piece of regulation in this, in this space. But beyond that, there's very little. There are no significant transparency requirements that Congress has imposed on the social media companies. There has been very little antitrust enforcement in the United States. There's been a little bit more in Europe. Because the First Amendment binds only government actors, there's no First Amendment litigation against the platforms, or no serious First Amendment litigation against the platforms. So it's really, I wouldn't say it's an unregulated space, but the platforms have a lot of space to do what they want to do. And
can I jump in here just for a second, Jamil? Because
sure, yeah.
you're on such a great role. But I just wanted to note for the folks who may not know why Section 230 was actually put into law, like this was something that was done in the very early days of the internet, around actually protecting, because there were two actual competing cases that were going on in the courts at the time. One suing because they were saying, well, you're not moderating your content enough. And another suing a different company saying, you are moderating your content too much, right? And so Section 230 was crafted in an attempt through this liability protection to encourage these companies to feel more comfortable moderating more and therefore not being sued. And so this is where part of the problem comes in, and I think Jamil said it so eloquently earlier, is that if you remove it, probably actually the really big players will be okay because they can afford the lawyers to be able to respond to all of the lawsuits that would come in. But when you think about the smaller innovators who can get shut out, but who are protected today by the fact that they aren't going to be sued based on either they're moderating too much or not moderating enough, that like this is also at the heart of this conundrum.
Thank you both for tackling that question. I think you did a good job. And this one is actually for Amy. Can you share what's next for the Pew Center regarding research in this area?
Sure. I would say it's less the legalese and the issues with the companies themselves, and more about sort of how these developments and challenges are impacting the way Americans share information and are informed. And one of the things we've looked at and seen develop is the degree to which the dramatic political polarization that's in the country has really seeped into and become intertwined with where people are turning for news. And then in addition to that, now sort of what they're trusting, what they're believing, and even accepting to be facts or to be alternative facts. And we have had a year-long effort called the American News Pathways Project that is examining what people have seen, heard, or perceived in the news based on the news sources they rely on. And this is social media. It's also a mix of different types of traditional outlets, but also if you are thinking, when we ask about sort of what people are relying on most for their COVID-19 news, Trump and the administration is one of those. And so, in addition to places like the CDC or your local elected officials or state officials. And so these different types of providers of news and the differences that we see in what people have been exposed to and what they believe about certain things surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic in this country based on those sources. So it's really looking at the impact that what is sort of the important choice people have for where to turn, what the impact is on their sense of the reality and knowledge about what's occurring in the world and around us. So we will continue to dig into that. Social media is a big part of what we study. We also do try to look at the different platforms, and it is interesting, even when you get to Twitter, you're only at about 17% of US adults that, are using it for news. And so even with all the focus we have on that, it is just one part of the population. So we do continue to look at the full scope of where people are turning for news around these questions.
Actually, thank you for that reminder. 17% is lower than I realized, but it does seem to have like an outsized significance in our culture and what we know. And this is our last question of the evening. Doesn't the virality drive the business model of social media? It builds engagement and sharing, which drives impressions and revenue. How do we incentivize platforms to act? Another open question.
I do think that sort of goes back to what everybody was talking about earlier, just in terms of that, you know, the interest, that engagement, the sensationalism, sort of that is a factor of what's going to flow and be clicked on and drive people's attention in this space, just like it is in any other, right? I mean, it gets back to stories that people choose to put in, you know, different segments of television news or elsewhere. So I don't know that it's only a phenomenon to social media, but it's certainly, you know, a part of it. And as I was citing in the data earlier, certainly something that the public senses is a part of that environment as well.
I think to add on to what Amy was saying, I think it's so right? There's that old saying in news, if it bleeds, it leads. And so, you know, this is not a new phenomenon, and it's not restricted only to social media and how social media companies work. I think that recognizing that we are the product, we're not the actual customer, and asking ourselves, so how do we put leverage on the actual revenue stream from the actual customers, right? That, you know, that to see this as an issue of core values about what's important to our society, and the people who, you know, Facebook has admittedly built literally like the world's greatest direct marketing machine. And there are tens, hundreds of thousands of small businesses that are using Facebook and its incredible micro-targeting capabilities to be able to, you know, have side businesses or even entirely new businesses and industries that have been created. So I think to recognize, though, that with that comes a commensurate responsibility, and to ask ourselves then, you know, what is that counterweight? In my mind, I think it comes from the fact that we, the people, are the ones who make the decisions and the rules about what is right and wrong in our society. And I think that this comes from, like, first of all, just such an amazing set of people who are here tonight, who are listening, that each one of us can be taking action around how, you know, how we vote, and then the consequences of those votes, and then looking at how we as a people, right, and as a nation, look at how we want to regulate this, and what kind of rules we need to put around it, while I think, and incredibly importantly, protecting the civil rights of the people who are using these platforms. So I think that there, you know, that counterweight and that counterbalance needs to come. It needs to come from us. And, you know, I'll tell you, there are some companies that are doing some really innovative, interesting things here. TikTok, for all of the craziness that we hear in the news. My kids, by the way, love it. They're on it all the time. So one of the things that TikTok did is they said, we're going to actually create transparency centers in LA and in DC, and we're going to open this up so that literally experts from the field can come in, and you can literally view the source code. You can see what our product managers are actually seeing, and, you know, you can actually then come away with and give us suggestions, but also see what it is that we do and how we're doing it. And I think, you know, moving towards that deeper level of transparency is certainly a great first step, and one that should be modeled by the other companies as well.
Yeah, I guess I'd just add one, you know, additional tool to this kit of solutions, and that would be essentially public options here. You know, we have Facebook, but Facebook is, you know, it's a little bit like having only the National Enquirer, and we kind of need NPR, and there is no NPR version of social media right now. But it is conceivable that we could have public digital infrastructure of that kind. Not only is it conceivable, but at the Knight Institute, we have a whole project now where we're thinking about public digital infrastructure, and Ethan Zuckerman is now a visiting fellow at the Knight Institute and is sort of leading that project. But I think that's a hugely important piece of this, creating alternatives to the businesses that are organized around this surveillance advertising model. Because that model really is the source of a lot of the problems that we've been talking about. And if you could come up with a social media platform that didn't rely on that model, it might not have the same problems.
Thank you for that reminder that the infrastructure we have isn't the only type that can exist for us communicating with each other. And I think we're just about out of time, but I wanted to thank our audience for these wonderful questions. And just, it's been a pleasure to have this really thoughtful, intelligent conversation with all of our panelists. Even when there's disagreement, it's just couched in like the most thoughtful and detailed way possible. We are never going to get clicks this way, you guys, but you know, this was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lotta. Thank you again to Lotta, Jamil, Dave, and Amy. I think Jamil said this at the beginning. We could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but we won't just tonight. We'll hopefully continue the conversation at home as well. I just want to give one more thank you to the Meadows Foundation, our sponsor for the series, to our partners, AJC's Community of Conscience and the Communities Foundation of Texas, and of course to you all for joining us tonight. I hope everyone has a pleasant evening. Stay safe, stay well, and we will see you all next time. Thank you so much.